Hi, welcome to another talk about herd immunity and how herd immunity is not immunity. Sounds like it, but it's not. So let's discover what herd immunity is. Okay. Immunity definition, according to the Library of Medicine, says that immunity refers to the state of being insusceptible or resistant to a noxious agent or process, especially a pathogen or infectious disease. This immunity may occur naturally or be produced by prior exposure or immunization. Sounds good. The word insusceptible is derived from the Latin words meaning in, not susceptible, or meaning capable of receiving, with susceptible itself coming from the word, which means to receive. It is used to describe something or someone that is not capable of being influenced or affected. Some synonyms of insusceptibility include resistance, immune, impervious, and so on. All right, sounds good. Questions. Question one: if your neighbor had their gallbladder removed, would that affect your gallbladder? If your neighbor is immune to something, does that make you immune as well? This is what we want to be able to discover and define. What actually is herd immunity? The term herd immunity is counterintuitive, as it implies that the individual immunity is conferred, whereas it actually refers to the indirect protection a community might derive from the collective immunity of its members. Sounds confusing. In the historical context, the concept of herd immunity was first proposed in the 1930s by Alexander Delgarno and later developed by others. At that time, the primary focus was on the protection of susceptible individuals within a community rather than the individual community itself. Herd immunity describes the speculation where a sufficient proportion of the population becomes immune to a pathogen, thereby reducing the transmission of that pathogen. Makes sense. If you're not exposed to it, you're not going to catch it. But it has nothing to do with your individual immunity. It has to do with whether or not the pathogen is present in the community. So let's take a look at this concept of herd immunity, its history, theory, and practice. So back in 1993, there was a lot of research taking place about this concept of herd immunity. And direct from this peer-reviewed article, there was this clearly defined statement. Along with the growth of interest in herd immunity, there has been a proliferation of views of what it means or even of whether it exists at all. Several authors have written on data on measles, which challenge the principle of herd immunity, and others cite widely divergent estimates. Still, others have commented on the failure or absence of herd immunity against rubella at all. So, why is it called herd immunity if no immunity is conferred to an individual? Well, sometimes there is something called a somatic change or drift. A somatic change or drift refers to a form of language change regarding the evolution of word usage, where the modern meaning is radically different from the original usage. It involves a change in one of the meanings of the word, where senses and connotations can be added, removed, or altered over time, often resulting in cognates across space and time having very different meanings. What the heck does that mean? Well, some examples of somatic change include awful. It originally meant inspiring wonder, as in full of awe. But now it means extremely bad. So it went from one meaning, being full of awe, to meaning something that's bad. Gregarious, originally described as something remarkably good, but now means something remarkably bad. To fathom something originally meant to encircle one's arms, but now means to understand after much thought. I think a semantic change or drift is happening with this word immunity. Remember, immunity has to do with you. It has to do with your immune system. Remember, if your neighbor had their gallbladder removed, that doesn't affect you. If your neighbor isn't immune to something because they have a strong immune system, it means that that's working for them and not you. A lack of exposure is something good for all of us. If I'm not exposed to something, I don't have to worry about it. But using this word immunity is, I think, intentionally designed to create a semantic change or drift to have a different meaning of what the word immunity means. All right, so let's take a look at something about the effectiveness of the coronavirus disease and this bivalent vaccine. So the bivalent vaccine, this is done from the Cleveland Clinic, and this had a looking at all of their employees, and the results showed the risk of COVID-19 also increased with time since the most recent prior COVID-19 episode and the number of vaccine doses previously received. Let me say that again. The risk of COVID also increased over time and with the number of vaccine doses previously received. The risk of COVID increased with the number of doses previously received. Now let's take a look at that herd immunity thing. So if we're going to get vaccinated, and the vaccination is going to lead us to not being able to be exposed to it anymore, and we find that research is telling us that the more vaccines you received in time exposed, the more vaccine ineffectiveness occurred, or the risk of COVID increased and not decreased. Let's take a look at the actual numbers. Again, from that same Cleveland Clinic study, you take a look and you can see at dose 0, you had 12%, at dose 1, 5%, but at dose 2 and 3, 45% on both of those with the increased dosage. So you increased your chances of catching COVID with the larger or more amount of doses of the vaccine you received. Is that conferring herd immunity? I don't think so. All right, what does the absolute risk reduction or risk difference if you take a vaccine? So we saw that the more you took the vaccine from that Cleveland Clinic study, the more COVID you actually got. But what is the absolute risk difference if you took the vaccine in the first place? So I did another video on this just recently. You could go and take a look at it, and labeled the absolute risk reduction or risk difference. So this represents the proportion of patients who are spared the adverse outcome as a result of having received the experimental rather than the control therapy or the placebo. This absolute risk reduction also gives us the number needed to treat or the number needed to vaccinate to prevent one infection. Okay, sounds simple. So what was the absolute risk reduction for the COVID vaccines? Well, here we can see them. The Pfizer, 0.84%. Moderna, 1.24%. It goes down 1.1%, 1.19%, 0.93%, 1.23%, 0.76%. These are the absolute risk reductions that were shown in the clinical trial data for these different COVID-19 vaccines. The number needed to vaccinate or the number needed to treat to prevent one infection, we see range from 119 people for the Pfizer to 131 people for the CoronaVax. So we're having this idea that you need to vaccinate this many people to prevent one infection. So tell me, how could a herd immunity, how could a herd that's not stopping transmission protect us? That's what I want you to think about. So now we know that herd immunity is not actual immunity. It's a controversial theory involving reducing population exposure through increased population immunity. Basically, if the pathogen is not around, you cannot be exposed to it. We know immunity means the state of being insusceptible or resistance to a noxious agent or process, especially a pathogen or an infectious disease. We know that the COVID vaccines only offered an average 1% absolute risk reduction, and the Cleveland Clinic study demonstrated the more vaccines received, the more COVID infections occurred. What can an average person conclude from this information? Can a herd immunity be achieved under these conditions? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts and ideas, and let's get this idea of herd immunity in a clear, more understandable manner in our community. If we know that herd immunity does not mean your immune system is enhanced in any way, if we in the community know that the absolute risk reductions are about 1%, if you in the community know that the more COVID vaccines you took, the more COVID you got, then we'd understand the idea of herd immunity and COVID might not be what we're told they are. Let me know what you think. Thank you very much.